Opening up central diagonals immediately sets the stage for dynamic piece play and claims valuable space. Embracing asymmetry, black immediately stakes a claim on the d4 square and prepares to contest the center's expansive territory. Developing a knight here contests central squares and prepares for pawn advances, setting up a dynamic struggle for board control. Black immediately contests the center and prepares to develop the bishop, embracing the dynamic nature of this Sicilian defense. Opening the center instantly challenges black's structure, creating a dynamic struggle for pawn control and promising tactical fireworks. Black opens the c-file, immediately contesting central influence and preparing for potential piece activity along that key diagonal. Unleashing a knight to the center, white immediately challenges the pawn structure and opens diagonals for active piece play. Accelerating development, this knight immediately eyes the e4 pawn, challenging white's central grip. This develops a knight to a central square, immediately challenging black's piece placement. Preparing to expand on the queen side and prevent white's knight from reaching a strong outpost on b5 or c4 is the clear intention here. This flank advance on the king side looks like a preemptive measure, perhaps to prevent the knight from eyeing g4, or more likely, to prepare a kingside expansion later with g4. It's a rather quiet move, but it subtly alters the pawn structure and creates a tiny airspace for the king. Shaping the Sicilian dragon's familiar fianchetto, this move prepares to tuck the bishop away on g7, influencing the long diagonal and potentially reinforcing the queenside with a solid pawn structure. Aggressively pushing forward, white aims to seize the initiative by disrupting black's natural development and creating immediate weaknesses around the kingside. However, this forward thrust might overextend the pawn chain, potentially leaving white vulnerable to counterplay on the now open files if black can react precisely. Developing the bishop to g7 creates a formidable diagonal that pressures white's center and prepares for castling into safety, while simultaneously eyeing the kingside. Aggressively pushing the kingside pawns, white aims to cramp black's position and potentially open lines against the king. This pawn thrust creates immediate spatial pressure and forces black to consider how to counter the impending expansion on the flank. The dark squares around black's king are becoming a concern. Relocating the knight to the edge of the board here initiates a fascinating positional gamble, sacrificing central influence for potential kingside harassment and a unique defensive shield against white's aggressive pawn thrusts, forcing white to reconsider their pawn structure's integrity. Solidifying the knight's outpost and preparing to castle, this development aims to shelter the king while maintaining influence over the center. This pawn thrust aggressively challenges white's central pawn, aiming to seize space and disrupt white's knight outpost while simultaneously opening lines for black's pieces. It's a bold statement, creating immediate tension and forcing white to make crucial decisions about the pawn structure's future. Pivoting the knight to b3 aims to reinforce the d4 square and potentially prepare a future c4 advance, creating a solid central structure while dislodging the knight from its currently somewhat exposed d4 outpost. This knight's maneuver directly challenges white's pawn structure, aiming to pry open lines and disrupt white's kingside ambitions. It's a bold repositioning, seeking to exploit the f4 square as a central outpost and perhaps prepare a counterattack on the f-file. The knight's current location on h5 was awkward, but this leap signifies a desire for active participation. Pushing the knight to d5 targets black's central structure and aims to exploit the potentially vulnerable e5 pawn, while also preparing to occupy the c7 square. The knight, after a tactical skirmish, retreats to a more secure square, simplifying the position and clearing the f4 outpost for potential future action, while also forcing white's own knight to reposition and potentially open up lines that could be exploited later. The queen's bold advance to d5 seizes central space and immediately eyes black's kingside, forcing a positional decision on how to protect that vulnerable point. Establishing central presence with the knight, black aims to disrupt white's pawn chain and open lines for counterplay, a crucial step in this dynamic Sicilian dragon structure. Unveiling a hidden threat, This bishop aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened light squares around the king. Unleashing the bishop from its diagonal prison transforms the piece's utility from a mere pawn protector to an active attacker, immediately challenging the central control white was attempting to solidify with the bishop pair. Opening the h-file now exposes white's king-pawn to potential future pressure, a subtle shift in the game's power dynamics. Black shifts the queen to c8, a crucial maneuver that eyes the weak c2 pawn and prepares to connect the rooks, while simultaneously unpinning the knight from the potentially vulnerable e5 square. Retreating the queen to the d1 square, white concedes the central tension and opts for a defensive posture, clearing the d4 square for a potential knight return, and seeking to consolidate the position rather than actively challenging black's growing space. Black brilliantly reroutes the knight, a classic maneuver to exploit the weakened dark squares and create attacking potential on the queenside and center. This knight on d4 is a thorn in white's side, eyeing c2 and potentially pressuring the d2 pawn, while simultaneously disrupting white's piece coordination and posing immediate threats that require careful attention rather than passive defense. Initiating a pawn thrust here aims to dislodge that troublesome knight on f4 and subsequently gain control of the d5 square, while simultaneously preparing to expand on the queenside with b4, potentially creating new attacking avenues and hindering black's knight development. The knight's daring dive to b3, now met with its capture, dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating a double d-pawn for white that could become a long-term liability. Black has skillfully maneuvered their pieces to exploit the temporary disruption, aiming to open lines for their own attack. This exchange, while seemingly straightforward, opens up fascinating positional possibilities and tactical traps for both sides. White must now carefully consider how to consolidate their position and prevent black from leveraging the open c-file. Opening the a-file with the pawn break creates immediate pressure on black's queenside, forcing them to deal with potential infiltration and potentially exposing weaknesses around the c6 knight. Shifting the queen to e6 initiates a subtle repositioning, aiming to connect the rooks and potentially eye the central d4 pawn while also creating a defensive shield for the king. It's a bid for greater harmony in black's pieces, seeking to untangle the knight on f4 and prepare for a more active middle game, subtly challenging white's queen placement and the doubled pawns on the king side. Opening up the a-file now, white aims to infiltrate black's queenside, forcing a response and potentially creating weaknesses in the pawn structure if black isn't careful about defending the b-pawn and the c-file. Black is daring to challenge white's queenside initiative. By advancing the f-pawn, they aim to pry open the kingside and potentially target the insecure white king, while simultaneously creating a new pawn chain that could influence central play in the long run. Stepping onto the d5 square, white's queen aims to disrupt black's kingside slumber and potentially exploit the open files now arising from the pawn exchange. This aggressive placement not only eyes potential forks on c6 and e6, but also prepares to support a central pawn push or a coordinated attack with the rook on a8. Observe how this centralizing maneuver creates immediate pressure, forcing black to react and potentially commit their own pieces to a defensive posture rather than continuing their intended queenside expansion. The knight on f4 is now under scrutiny, its advanced outpost suddenly looking more like a liability than an asset. Entering this exchange, black surrenders the initiative but initiates a welcome simplification, aiming to relieve pressure on the king side and transition towards a more manageable middle game structure. Repositioning the rook to the open file immediately asserts pressure on the king side and prepares for potential pawn advances or infiltrations into black's territory, while simultaneously offering a clear path for future piece coordination. Embracing the challenge of a compromised pawn structure, black now focuses on activating the king, preparing it to participate in the upcoming endgame exchanges. A wise decision given the queens are off the board and the ensuing strategic battle will demand every piece's active involvement. Opening the g-file creates immediate pressure on black's king, leveraging the weakened pawn structure and potentially creating attacking avenues down the open file. Re-establishing development and solidifying the pawn structure on the king side, The bishop's return to its active diagonal now offers a more coherent defensive shield for the monarch, preparing for a more balanced middle game. Pushing the pawn to g5 now aims to disrupt black's unified pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's pieces, even if temporarily. It creates a dynamic imbalance, sacrificing some immediate pawn integrity for the possibility of long-term pressure. Consider how this pawn advance affects the breathing room of the black knight on f4, forcing it to reevaluate its position. This might also offer a chance to gain space on the king side, a crucial element as the game progresses towards potential endgames. Securing the bishop's retreat while preparing to contest the open d-file demonstrates astute defensive planning, aiming to neutralize the lingering pressure and potentially establish a more active post for the pieces. Unearthing the king from its sheltered nook, the monarch embarks on a risky promenade, potentially inviting skirmishes near the d-file where pieces now clash with less impunity. Initiating activity on the open file signals a proactive approach to destabilize white's pawn structure and challenge for central control, aiming to exploit the potential weaknesses created by the earlier pawn advances. A subtle repositioning aims to bolster the e3 square and prepare for potential pawn advances on the king side, while simultaneously eyeing opportunities to restrict black's minor pieces. The rook slides into the open file, asserting its presence on the c-file and preparing to challenge white's control there, potentially creating new avenues for the bishop and king to become more active. Injecting dynamism into the position, this pawn advance aims to seize more territory on the queen side and potentially create an outpost for a piece. Black fortifies the queenside pawn chain, a preemptive measure against white's potential expansion with the pawn, while simultaneously creating a secure outpost for the knight on d4 should it ever get there again. Reinforcing the kingside pawn chain and preparing to contest the central files appears to be the immediate priority, aiming to restrict black's bishop activity and potentially build pressure on the queen side. Piloting the king toward the queen side offers sanctuary from the ongoing skirmishes and prepares for potential pawn breakthroughs that might emerge on the king's flank. Positioning the rook on the file now aims to exploit the open file and potentially pressure black's queenside pawn structure, while also preparing for future defensive maneuvers should the king be forced to move further. Bringing the rook to c6 aims to free the d-file for further rook activity, potentially threatening a pawn on the c-file and creating more dynamic attacking chances by linking the rooks, while also solidifying the pawn structure. Unlocking the h-file presents a double-edged sword. While offering attacking potential against the black king's defenses, it potentially weakens white's own king by opening a diagonal for a counterpunch. Protecting the bishop before committing to a pawn push offers vital defensive cover, simultaneously preparing to contest the open king's file that has been developing with the recent rook exchanges. Gaining a crucial tempo by reinforcing the h-file assault, this maneuver prepares to double rooks and exert immense pressure on the black king's immediate vicinity, potentially forcing concessions or creating a decisive breakthrough. The black rook, now repositioned to c7, aims to support its partner on the c-file and prepare for potential central pawn advances, asserting a subtle claim over that important artery of the board. Securing the kingside pawn chain with this advance discourages black's intended pawn breaks and prepares for a potential kingside expansion. Injecting central tension now forces white's hand in a constricted queenside. Black aims to shatter white's pawn chain and open lines for their pieces, turning the focus to the isolated queenside pawns and creating dynamic counterplay. Activating the queenside rook to potentially contest the open file and pressure black's pawn structure feels like a strategic readjustment, aiming to prevent black from consolidating further control. Initiating a pawn storm on the queenside with the rook now poised on the file, black seeks to disrupt white's compact structure and potentially create passed pawns, while simultaneously defending against white's looming presence on the kingside. Finally, a breakthrough. This seemingly simple check injects immediate tension, forcing black's king into a precarious new position and potentially opening up lines for your remaining rooks to become active on the queenside. The black monarch, now liberated from the cramped confines of its starting square, boldly steps into the arena, aiming to centralize and potentially exploit the open files that white's pawn structure has created. This is a pivotal moment where the active king could become a powerful asset, or conversely, a tempting target in the ensuing endgame. A calculated check, aiming to disrupt the consolidated black king and potentially pry open lines with tempo. The black monarch, exposed on e6, suddenly becomes the focal point of a dangerous mating net being woven by white's coordinated rooks and bishop. This choice abandons crucial pawn protection on the queen side, potentially allowing white to exploit the open a file or penetrate with the king for further disruptive attacks. The exposed royal presence dramatically alters the board's positional landscape, shifting the game's immediate focus towards defensive improvisation rather than sustained counterplay. Pushing the rook to the 8th rank immediately aims to disrupt black's king's safety and potentially trap the rook on the queen side. Repositioning the monarch under fire, a bold gamble to re-establish a defensive perimeter or perhaps launch a desperate counterthrust before white's rooks fully entrench. The rook's repositioning to the queen's side aggressively seeks to exploit the open file, aiming to disrupt black's cramped position and potentially trap the king once it ventures further from its sanctuary. Shaking the rook from its precarious position on the 1st rank finally allows black to breathe, aiming to consolidate the king side and prepare for the inevitable pawn advances on the queen side. A daring repositioning, the rook swings across the board, aiming to exploit the open file and put pressure on black's somewhat exposed monarch. Recognizing the opponent's bishop's potential to influence the queenside pawn structure, black retreats to g7, safeguarding the piece while keeping it active for a potential future exchange or defensive maneuver. Capturing the bishop simplifies the material balance, fundamentally altering the game's character towards an endgame where the open files and exposed monarch become paramount considerations. The bishop's capture, though seemingly forced, surrenders a crucial defensive piece, leaving your monarch significantly more exposed to future attacks, especially with white's rook now eyeing open diagonals and files. A decisive material advantage is now secured, exploiting the open king and an uncastled monarch, paving the way for a straightforward endgame victory. Seizing the open file, the rook now targets the weak kingside pawn structure, forcing a response that might further expose black's monarch. A brilliant sacrifice to chase the black king into the open, creating irresistible mating threats. The black king, having ventured far from its protective pawn shield, now finds itself in a precarious position, a target for the remaining white pieces in this suddenly tactical skirmish. Initiating a devastating pawn thrust to break open the kingside further and capitalize on black's exposed monarch. Venturing the king into this exposed territory invites immediate reckoning, potentially unraveling the entire defensive structure and exposing black to devastating discovered attacks or forks as white's remaining pieces coordinate their assault. The monarch ventures into the open, seeking to activate its presence by supporting the pawn advance and potentially offering a safer haven on the 3rd rank. Sacrificing the pawn opens a critical diagonal, forcing the white king into a precarious position and potentially creating opportunities for the black pieces to coordinate their attack. Seizing the opportunity, the pawn advances, opening a path for the king to participate in the endgame and simultaneously pressuring the advanced black pawn. Delivering a check forces the white king into an even more exposed position, sacrificing material to open lines against the opponent's vulnerable monarch. Fortifying the king's safety, this centralizing maneuver aims to secure the monarch and prepare for potential kingside action while simultaneously blocking the d-file. The king's precarious journey across the board culminates in a desperate attempt to find refuge, but the enemy's bishop now stands as a formidable guardian of that sanctuary, creating a tight knot of tactical possibilities and limiting the monarch's escape routes. The rook's retreat to f1 now aims to bolster the king's defense and prepare for a potential regrouping of forces. Bringing the bishop back to the queenside seeks to reactivate this piece after its passive placement on the kingside. Your move 44, b5. This bishop's relocation is an attempt to find more active squares, perhaps to support potential pawn breaks or simply to reposition for defensive duties. The king side is quite open, and this defensive flexibility is key. It's also a subtle way to prepare for potential exchanges later on. The white monarch ventures out, seeking to exploit the open lines and potentially launch a dangerous advance towards the kingside majority. A risky but potentially decisive endeavor given black's somewhat compromised pawn structure. Embracing the cramped space, black chooses to reposition the bishop to a more defensive square, aiming to bolster the weakened kingside pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances while keeping an eye on the open g-file. Sacrificing the rook opens up a decisive discovered attack, forcing the black king further into exposed territory and paving the way for a swift mating net. This king's desperate dance into the open, seeking refuge in a now compromised corner, exposes it to the relentless pressure of the white rook and bishop battery, a risky gambit when a more conservative retreat might have consolidated the pawn structure. Activating the king is paramount in this endgame, aiming to establish a safe harbor while simultaneously putting pressure on black's weakened pawn structure. Unlocking the d-file with the rook offers the potential to disrupt white's king's safety, though it allows the g-pawn to advance, creating further complications. Pawn advances can be double-edged swords, and this particular push seems to be an attempt to pry open the king's defenses, but it might also inadvertently weaken the pawn structure. A daring check that forces white's king into a more exposed central position, potentially sacrificing a pawn for immediate king attack prospects. Gaining crucial space on the king side, this advance forces black's rook to retreat, consolidating white's advantage and preparing to activate the remaining pieces in the center. Resigning to the inevitable pawn push forward feels like a last resort, conceding critical central space and inviting a powerful rook invasion that will undoubtedly unravel your remaining defenses. Pioneering the pawn into enemy territory creates a critical bottleneck, forcing the black king to remain in a precarious defensive posture. Pushing the bishop to d8 opens up lines for the remaining rook on f5 to become more active, potentially targeting weak pawns on the king side or supporting a future pawn advance. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal power, this move aims to exploit the newly opened lines and restrict black's king. The exchange of bishops on f6 severs black's last connection to active defense, leaving the weakened king side and the advanced pawn vulnerable to white's overwhelming material advantage and looming king march. The pawn's advance finally liberates the f-file, creating a vital open highway for white's rook to exploit black's compromised king position. The rook's forced return to the 7th rank now makes the pawn's advance to the 6th a significant positional concession, opening lines for the white king and potentially creating unstoppable passed pawns. The white king bravely steps into the center, aiming to participate in the coming skirmishes and perhaps usher in a decisive checkmating sequence by coordinating with the rook and pushing the e-pawn. The black rook, finally free from its defensive duties on the back rank, now eyes the unprotected b2 pawn as a potential target, aiming to create active play and disrupt white's advantage. Re-establishing a rook's presence on the open e-file immediately pressures black's weakened pawn structure and prepares for further advances.